June 7th, 1942. 0320 hours. Western Pacific. Aboard the battleship Yamato. The air inside the flag plot is thick with cigarette smoke and the sour tang of sweat-soaked uniforms. Steel decks vibrate with the steady pulse of turbines, but the men gathered around the chart table barely hear it. They stare at the Pacific like it is a wound. Somewhere beyond the bulkheads, waves slap the hull in the dark. Somewhere farther still, 4 Japanese fleet carriers are gone. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands with his hands braced on the table edge, shoulders square, face carved into stillness. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, holds a pencil that will not stop moving, making small marks and notes on paper that already looks bruised by erasures. Staff officers speak in low voices, careful not to sound like they are accusing the sea itself. A signal officer enters, bowing, and reads the latest report. It is not the report Yamamoto wanted. It is the one he expected, and that makes it worse. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Names that only days ago meant power and precision, now spoken like funerals. Yamamoto does not shout. That is what the room expects from an angry god, and he refuses to give them that comfort. He turns his gaze to the operational map, to the neat lines and symbols that once promised control. The lines have become lies. Ugaki clears his throat. His voice is steady, but his eyes are red-rimmed from sleeplessness. The Americans struck as if guided, he says. At the decisive moment, another officer, a commander with ink-stained fingers from signal logs, hesitates. Their search planes found us quickly. He offers, and then, as if it tastes bitter, adds, and their carrier coordination was precise. Yamamoto's jaw tightens. For a moment he looks older than his years, a man who has spent decades studying an opponent who now seems to have stepped out of a shadow, holding tools Japan did not know existed. Guided, Yamamoto repeats softly, as if testing the word. He glances toward the chronometers, toward the plotted times of contact and attack. They arrived when our decks were most vulnerable. Ugaki turns a page. His pencil scratches. He has been writing down the same thought for hours in different forms, circling it like a bomber circling a target. The enemy acted not like a man guessing, but like a man reading. In another compartment, removed from Yamato's controlled quiet, survivors and messengers gather, voices roar. Reports arrive from the shattered First Air Fleet. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo is not here, but his presence hangs over everything. The staff speaks of hangar decks crowded with fuel hoses and bombs, of aircraft being shifted and rearmed, of moments stolen and wasted. Yet beneath the technical explanations, a deeper unease grows, a sensation that even perfect handling might not have saved them. A captain from air staff, his uniform rumpled from a night without sleep, leans in and speaks with bluntness. Admiral, the American dive bombers found our carriers through the cloud breaks at the exact time our combat air patrol was out of position. Their approach was coordinated. Their timing was uncanny. Another word that sounds like superstition, like sailors whispering about ghosts, but nobody laughs. Yamamoto's eyes narrow. What of their detection, he asks. How did they know where to look? The signal officer hesitates again, then speaks as if stepping onto thin ice. There were indications of enemy radar on their ships and perhaps on their aircraft. Our pilots reported ships that seemed to react before they were visible, turning guns and maneuvering as if warned. Ugaki's pencil pauses. Radar. The term is not new, but it is still half foreign. Still something spoken with a faint contempt, like a trick that can be dismissed. Yet contempt does not sink carriers, and tricks do not bring dive bombers to the exact patch of ocean where 4 flat tops are rearming. In the hours that follow, Yamamoto meets with senior officers in small groups, faces drawn, voices lower each time the same questions return. He does not call it magic. He calls it advantage. A staff officer suggests American luck, a fortunate sequence of sightings. Another talks about Japanese mistakes in reconnaissance, a missed report, a delayed launch. Yamamoto listens, and then he cuts through the excuses with a tone that turns the room cold. Luck does not repeat itself in perfect rhythm, he says. Not like this. Ugaki writes that down, the pencil biting harder than before. On another ship in the scattered fleet, officers replay the battle in their minds until it becomes an obsession. The Americans appeared on the horizon like they had been waiting. Their carriers were not where Japanese doctrine expected them to be. Their strike came not as a frantic gamble, but as a rehearsed solution. By late morning, Yamamoto is alone for a moment with Ugaki. Outside, the Pacific is brightening. Sunlight slips through a porthole and paints a thin white line across the chart table, crossing the grid where Midway sits like a tiny stone. Ugaki speaks quietly, careful with every syllable. "Admiral, it is possible the enemy read our signals." The words land with a dull weight. Yamamoto does not answer immediately. He stares at that thin line of light as if it is a blade. He thinks of the meticulous planning, the elaborate feints, the confidence that the enemy would react slowly and blindly. Then he finally speaks, voice low enough that it feels like a confession. "If that is true," he says, "then we did not lose to aircraft alone." Ugaki nods once. His pencil moves again, and the sound is like distant gunfire. The suspicion takes root in that moment, in a steel room on a steel ship, far from the smoke of burning carriers. It is not yet a confirmed fact. It is a fear, sharp and growing. Japan has met an enemy who seems to see in the dark. 2 days later, the fear has a destination. June 9th, 1942. Tokyo. Naval General Staff Headquarters. Summer heat sits on the city like a wet blanket. In the corridors of the Navy Ministry Complex, ceiling fans stir the air, but do not cool it. Officers move with restrained urgency, footsteps measured, voices kept low, as if volume itself could worsen the news. In a meeting room with blackout curtains drawn, the smell of ink, stale tea, and damp wool uniforms hangs over a long table. Maps of the Central Pacific are pinned to boards. Red and blue pins cluster around Midway like blood under a fingernail. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, sits with his back straight, hands folded, face unreadable. Around him are staff officers who have not slept properly since the first fragmentary signals came in. A clerk places a stack of dispatches on the table. The paper looks clean. The contents are not. A senior operations officer clears his throat and begins to speak, carefully, as if the shape of each sentence matters. He describes losses, the timeline, the way American carrier aircraft arrived with crushing precision. He speaks of search patterns that should have protected the fleet and did not. He speaks of contact reports that came too late or not at all. When he finishes, silence expands in the room, filling every corner. Nagano finally speaks. His voice is calm, but it has a sharp edge like a knife laid flat. "Our enemy acted with knowledge," he says, "not merely with courage. A staff captain, younger than the rest, cannot help himself. They anticipated our move," he says, and then stops. Realizing how close that sounds to accusation, another officer, from communications, adjusts his glasses with fingers that tremble slightly. "There is the matter of our signals," he begins. "Our traffic was heavy. Our schedule was fixed. If the enemy had any means of reading even fragments, they could infer our intention." Nagano's eyes narrow. "You suggest compromise?" The communications officer bows his head. "We suggest the possibility. The word possibility is a refuge. It is also an admission that the Navy does not know, Across the table, a representative from the technical department speaks next, voice more confident, as if machines are safer than mysteries. He describes American radar in careful terms, not as a rumor but as a pattern. Reports from pilots, from escorts, from scattered engagements over the previous months. Ships that opened fire at night with accuracy. Fighters that arrived at the right height and angle as if directed by an invisible hand. Enemy carrier groups appear to coordinate their combat air patrol with greater efficiency. The technical officer says their fighters arrive sooner. Their gunnery is steadier. It is consistent with radar-assisted fighter direction. The room does not react like men hearing a new invention. They react like men realizing they have been fighting in a fog while the enemy fights in daylight. Nagano's gaze shifts to a map of the Pacific, to the long distances and empty spaces Japan once relied on. If the enemy can see, he says slowly, then distance no longer protects us. You can feel it, even if you are not in that room. The way a doctrine begins to wobble, the way confidence turns into accounting. At the far end of the table, one of Yamamoto's planning officers is present, a hard-eyed man who helped design the Midway operation. He speaks with a bitterness he tries to hide. Our plan depended on surprise, he says. We did not achieve surprise. Therefore, the enemy had information we did not consider. Someone murmurs a phrase that will be repeated in different forms over the coming months. The Americans have a secret weapon. Not a single bomb, not a single ship. Something unseen. In another office down the hall, a smaller group gathers around a secure telephone. The line crackles as voices from the fleet and from shore exchange clipped phrases. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki's notes have been summarized. Yamamoto's suspicions have been translated into staff language. Enemy intelligence advantage suspected. Enemy detection capabilities suspected. A staff officer taps the pencil against the desk. Faster and faster. If they read our operational code, he says, then our next move will also be known. A counter-argument comes quickly. Then change the code. The room goes quiet again because everyone understands what that means. Changing a fleet code is not a switch you flip. It is weeks of distribution, retraining, new books, new procedures, new errors. In wartime, errors kill. Another officer, older, speaks with the tired pragmatism of a man who has spent his life in naval bureaucracy. We will improve security, he says, but we must assume the enemy has other means as well. Reconnaissance, radar, better carrier doctrine. Carrier doctrine. The phrase sounds harmless until you picture it. American task forces, multiple carriers operating together, screens tight, fighters guided, strikes launched with coordinated timing. At Midway, Japanese carriers had fought as a single fist that got caught mid-swing. The Americans, it now seems, fought like two hands, working in concert, covering each other, feeding information, adapting faster. In the meeting room, Nagano rises, signaling the discussion is ending. He looks around at the faces, each one carrying a private calculation of what Midway means. His final words are not dramatic, but they settle like stone. We must assume the enemy possesses an advantage we cannot yet see, he said. Until we understand it, every operation is conducted under enemy eyes. Outside, Tokyo traffic continues. Streetcars rattle. Vendors call. The city does not know the full shape of the disaster. But inside the Navy's walls, the realization spreads. The ocean has eyes. June 18th, 1942. Hashirajima Anchorage. Inland Sea of Japan. Combined Fleet Headquarters. The inland sea looks peaceful, almost insulting in its calm. Green hills hold the horizon. Fishing boats move as if the war is far away. But anchored in the gray morning haze are warships that feel suddenly vulnerable, as if every mast and antenna is a confession. In a cramped conference room ashore, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto listens to voices that keep circling the same point. Something unseen helped the Americans at Midway. The question is not whether, the question is what. Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki sits near the end of the table, his ever-present notebook open, pencil poised. His eyes flick from speaker to speaker, collecting fragments the way a salvage crew collects wreckage. A communications specialist begins with the safest line. Our radio traffic increased before the operation, he says. We used familiar call signs. We transmitted schedules. We relied on ciphers to protect the meaning. He looks at Yamamoto, then at the officers beside him. If the enemy had even partial access, they could predict our axis of advance. A younger staff officer pushes back. They could not read our operational code so quickly. He insists, as if certainty is armor. It is complex. The specialist does not argue. He only replies with a quiet sentence that makes the air feel colder. Complexity does not matter if the enemy has time and discipline. Yamamoto's expression does not change, but his fingers tighten on the edge of the table. He has spent years in America. He knows what American industry can build. He also knows what American universities can train. Another officer, this one from intelligence, stands and places a folder on the table. Inside are after-action reports from carrier pilots and escort commanders, each one describing moments that did not make sense at the time. Several units report enemy fighters arriving at interception points with unusual consistency. The intelligence officer says, not random, not merely good luck. He points to a line on a page. Then another. Our aviators describe being met at altitude, not searched for. They describe enemy ships opening fire at ranges that suggest early warning. This is consistent with radar. Radar. The word lands again. Heavier now because it is being treated like a battlefield fact, not a rumor. A technical officer from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal speaks next. He is not an admiral, not even close. But the room leans in anyway. His world is circuits and valves, not doctrine and honor. The enemy has fielded sets capable of detecting aircraft beyond visual range, he says. They also appear to use radar to direct fighters. It reduces wasted patrol time. It puts fighters where they are needed, when they are needed. He does not insult Japanese technology, but he does not flatter it either. Our own sets are improving, but reliability and training are limited. Even when detection occurs, converting it into coordinated action is difficult. Ugaki writes, and the pencil scratches harder. Detection, direction, coordination, each is a step. The Americans are taking all of them. Then the conversation turns to the most uncomfortable possibility. Captain of Intelligence, voice careful, says, there is another pattern, Admiral. The enemy was waiting at Midway. Their carriers were positioned with confidence. They did not search widely. They searched precisely. He pauses as if he can feel the room's resistance. This suggests not only radar, but knowledge of our plan. Knowledge, not observation, not chance. Knowledge. One of the senior admirals, face lined like weathered wood, speaks in a low tone meant to sound practical. What are you implying? The intelligence captain answers without drama. That our communications may be compromised. Ugaki's pencil stops. You can almost hear the silence in his notebook. Yamamoto finally speaks, voice level. If our code is compromised, he says, then the enemy is not only seeing our aircraft, he is seeing our thoughts. No one moves. No one coughs. Even the ceiling fan feels too loud. A staff officer tries to anchor the discussion in action. We will change procedures, he says quickly. Reduce transmissions, tighten discipline, alter call signs, issue new books. Yamamoto nods once. Do it. But the Admiral's eyes remain fixed on the map of the Central Pacific. He is thinking beyond the next code change. beyond the next patrol, because even if Japan seals its messages, the enemy may still have the other advantage, the one that cannot be hidden with new ink. As the meeting breaks into smaller arguments, you can feel the war shifting under their feet. Japanese doctrine prized decisive battle and aggressive spirit, but spirit does not detect aircraft beyond the horizon. Spirit does not assemble scattered reports into a single picture fast enough to matter. Ugaki speaks quietly to a nearby officer, not as a superior, but as a man trying to understand a wound. At Midway, he says, we were struck at the worst moment. That is what haunts me. Not only that we were struck, but when, the officer answers with a bitter half-smile, as if someone told them, later, walking out into the humid air. Yamamoto stops and looks across the water at the anchored ships. Their silhouettes are strong. Their guns are heavy. Yet he imagines American carrier pilots climbing into the sun guided by instruments that do not care about courage, guided by information that travels faster than any ship. If you were standing there, you would feel it too. The sense that the battlefield has expanded into the invisible, not just steel and fire, but waves and signals, pulses and codes. Yamamoto turns to Ugaki. His voice is low, meant for one man and a notebook. We must fight an enemy who has found a way to remove uncertainty, he says. That is the true weapon. Ugaki writes the sentence down as if it might be used later to explain how the war began to tilt. Not with a single battle, but with the realization that the Americans were learning how to see. July 1942. Rabaul. The airfield smells of coral dust, gasoline, and rotting vegetation baked by the sun. The front has moved south and east, but the shock of Midway follows every staff meeting like a second shadow. In the heat haze above the runway, Japanese fighters sit with canopies open, mechanics wiping sweat from their chins as they work. Pilots lean against crates, listening to officers talk about the enemy with a new word in their vocabulary. Radar. In a command hut near the edge of the field, maps are pinned to bamboo walls, corners curling from humidity. A naval aviator, lieutenant commander, face drawn from long sorties, describes an interception that should not have happened. We approached low, under cloud, he says. Yet they met us, not late, not searching. They were already there. An army officer scoffs softly, but does not speak. The Navy officers exchange looks, because they have heard this too many times now. The Americans are anticipating. A message arrives from Truk, then from Japan, fragments stitched into a grim pattern. Carrier operations are being reorganized. Communications discipline is being tightened. New procedures are being drafted. But out here, above jungle and sea, the problem is immediate. How do you fight an enemy that seems to know where you will be? In a larger headquarters, aboard a cruiser in Simpson Harbor, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa meets with his staff. He is sharp-eyed, aggressive, a man who prefers decisive action and hates excuses. Yet even Mikawa is forced to grapple with a foe that does not behave like the Americans of 1941. An intelligence officer reports on American ship movements near the Solomons. They respond rapidly, he says. They concentrate forces as if forewarned. Their carriers do not wander. They appear where they are needed. Mikawa's fingers tap the table once, twice. Forewarned by what? He asks. The intelligence officer hesitates. Radar may contribute. But there is also the matter of their code breaking. The room tightens. That word is more dangerous than any bomb because it implies a failure at the core. A captain on Mikawa's staff tries to steer it back toward what can be controlled. We have changed some procedures, he says. We are reducing transmissions. Mikawa's eyes narrow, and yet they still appear. A naval communications specialist, newly arrived from the home islands, speaks with an engineer's bluntness. Even if our codes are secure, he says, Their radar gives them tactical warning. If they can detect a raid at a great distance, they can launch fighters and maneuver ships before our pilots even see the target. You can picture it. Japanese aircraft rising from the sea, engines roaring, pilots thinking they have surprise, only to find a wall of fighters already at altitude, already turning into them. The specialist continues, "The enemy also uses radar to control anti-aircraft fire. It improves accuracy at night and in bad weather. Night and bad weather. The old allies of the attacker are being stolen." Later that month, far away in Japan, in a technical briefing room at Yokosuka, a group of admirals and engineers examine captured fragments, reports, and sketches. There is no dramatic unveiling of a single device. There is a slow, humiliating realization that the Americans have built systems, not just weapons. A radar set is not just a box. It is training, procedures, plotting rooms, fighter direction teams, standardized reporting. It is ships talking to ships with disciplined brevity, creating a shared picture. An admiral, older, whose career began before radios were trusted, frowns at the diagrams. "So they are guided," he murmurs. "Like a sword thrust guided by eyes we cannot see." An engineer nods. Yes, they have a method to convert detection into action quickly. Another admiral asks the question everyone is thinking, but no one wants to say out loud. "Can we match it?" The engineer does not answer immediately. He chooses his words like a man choosing where to step on thin ice. "We can build sets," he says. "But we are behind in production, and we are behind in the organization required to use them fully. Behind, not by months, by mindset." By August, whispers have hardened into staff language. The enemy's secret weapon is not a single device, but a combination of radar, intelligence, and carrier coordination that amplifies American strength and shrinks Japanese advantages. In the South Pacific, Japanese ships and aircraft begin to adjust. They fly different routes. They attempt radio silence. They change call signs. They launch night attacks. But every adjustment feels like a man changing clothes while the room itself is on fire. One evening in Rabaul, an exhausted air group commander sits on an ammunition crate. Helmet beside him, sweat drying into salt lines on his cheeks. A younger pilot asks him quietly, "How do they always know?" The commander stares out at the darkening runway where the jungle begins. He does not want to answer because the answer is a kind of defeat. "They see us," he says finally. "They hear us. And sometimes it feels like they read us." The pilot swallows. The idea settles into his chest like a stone. Back in Tokyo, reports stack higher. Each one is a small testimony that the battlefield has changed. Admirals who once spoke in terms of tonnage and bravery now speak in terms of detection ranges and intercepted messages, in terms of a war fought by invisible pulses. And beneath it all is the question that never leaves the table. If America's secret weapon is information, how do you sink information? October 1942. Iron Bottom Sound. The night is black. The sea a slick sheet broken only by phosphorescent trails and the faint glow of burning fuel on distant water. Japanese ships slide through the darkness with engines throttled low, funnels smoking as little as possible. The men on deck speak in whispers. This is the kind of fight Japan understands. Night. Surprise. Torpedoes. A blade in the dark. On the bridge of a heavy cruiser, officers peer out through binoculars that show nothing but deeper black. They listen for the rumble of guns, the distant thud of explosions. They wait for the moment when the American ships will appear as silhouettes. Too late to react. Then it happens. Not the sighting they expect, but something stranger. An American ship opens fire before the Japanese lookouts can even be certain there is a target. Shells scream overhead. Water erupts. A mast shatters. Men flinch as if struck by invisible hands. On the Japanese bridge, An officer stares into the night with disbelief. How? He breathes. They cannot see us. But they can, somewhere across the dark water. In an American combat information center, sailors stand around a glowing scope. Blips slide across a screen like ghosts given form. Voices call ranges and bearings with crisp certainty. Orders move from plot to bridge to gun director. In the time it takes a Japanese lookout to squint and doubt, American guns are already firing. For Japanese officers who survive these nights, the effect is not just tactical, it is psychological. The darkness, once an ally, has been stolen. A destroyer captain, face pale in the red glow of the bridge lights, watches his ship turn hard as shells fall closer. His mind races through the old rules. At night, you close unseen. You strike first. You vanish. Yet tonight, the first strike belongs to the enemy. After the action, in the damp, cramped interior of a surviving ship, officers gather around a table littered with coffee cups and damp charts. The air smells of cordite and seawater and fear. A senior officer speaks in a voice that is almost angry. They fired without visual contact, he says. They tracked us through rain squalls. Another nods. It is radar. It must be. A third officer, quieter, adds something more unsettling. And their formations are disciplined. Their ships support each other. They concentrate fire quickly. They do not fight like the Americans we met before. This is the secret weapon made visible in flashes of gunfire. News travels back through the fleet and then back to Japan. Each report is another nail. American radar is not just a gadget. It is a way of fighting. November 1942. Tokyo. Naval General Staff. Admiral Osami Nagano sits again in a meeting room heavy with smoke. His staff presents the latest analyses from the Solomons. Night battles where Japanese ships were hit first. Destroyers caught before they could launch torpedoes. Cruisers bracketed by gunfire that seemed to come from nowhere. An operations officer points to a timeline on the board. In multiple engagements, the enemy opened fire at ranges beyond effective visual detection. He says they achieved early straddles, suggesting fire control assisted by radar. Nagano's expression does not change, but the hand holding his cigarette pauses. Our night tactics, he says slowly, are being neutralized. A staff officer, bolder now because the evidence is too consistent to deny, says the enemy has combined radar with centralized coordination. They share contact information between ships faster than we can. Another man adds, they also appear to anticipate our reinforcement runs. Their patrols intercept with accuracy. The room again circles back to the other half of the invisible war. Cryptanalysis, signals intelligence, the idea that Japanese movements are not discovered by scouting alone, but by listening. A communications officer speaks carefully. We have changed codes. We have reduced transmissions. But the enemy still positions forces effectively. It may indicate they are reading some part of our traffic or have other sources. Nagano exhales smoke. Or, he says, they do not need to read everything. They need only enough to predict. In the weeks that follow, Japanese leaders begin to talk about America's secret weapon in a new way. Not as a single advantage, but as a network of advantages that feed each other. Radar detects, fighter direction responds. Carriers coordinate. Signals intelligence informs strategy. Industrial production replaces losses. Each part strengthens the others like strands braided into rope. In a private conversation recorded in a staff diary, an admiral mutters something that feels like resignation. We are fighting an enemy who sees first and strikes first. Out in the Solomons, Japanese sailors learn it the hard way. A destroyer races down the slot at night, carrying supplies and troops. The men on deck cling to railings, faces damp with sea spray. They know American aircraft will come by day, so they run by night. The engines howl. The coastline slips past as a black shape. Then, faint at first, comes the rumble of distant guns. The bridge officer stiffens. "Enemy ships," he says, but he has no visual confirmation. Seconds later, star shells bloom overhead, turning the water into a silver mirror. The destroyer is suddenly naked in the light. Gunfire follows, precise and fast. The ship shudders. Men are thrown to the deck. The crew had counted on darkness. The enemy has turned darkness into a spotlight. When survivors crawl from the water or stagger onto a beach, they talk about the same thing in hoarse voices. The Americans knew. The Americans were waiting. The Americans fired first. Back in Japan, the phrase secret weapon begins to lose its mystery and gain its shape. It is information transformed into violence. March 1943. Tokyo, a conference room in the Navy Ministry. Walls lined with charts that now stretch across half the Pacific like a slow retreat drawn in ink. The men around the table are older than they were a year ago, not by months, but by battles. Their uniforms fit the same, but their faces do not. The conversation no longer pretends Midway was an accident. It is treated as the first clear signal that the enemy fights with a different kind of advantage. Admiral Osami Nagano sits at the head of the table again, his posture unchanged, his eyes more tired. Across from him is a senior representative from Combined Fleet, sent with summaries from Yamamoto's headquarters and from the bitter grind of the Solomons. Staff officers pass documents hand to hand. The paper is covered with numbers and phrases that would have sounded strange before the war. Detection ranges, intercept times, plotting procedures, radio direction findings. A technical officer speaks first, using a pointer on a chart. Enemy radar-equipped ships have repeatedly detected our forces at night beyond visual range, he says. They direct fighters and gunfire with increasing effectiveness. This is no longer limited to a few ships. It is spreading throughout their fleet. Nagano nods slightly. And our countermeasures? The officer hesitates. We can attempt jamming in limited cases. We can improve our own radar. But the enemy's advantage is not only the device. It is the organization that uses it. Organization. The word is almost an insult in a service that prides itself on spirit and initiative. Yet it keeps returning because it is true. An intelligence captain stands next and speaks with a careful tone that suggests he understands the danger of what he's about to say. There is also evidence, he begins, that the enemy has repeatedly anticipated our operations. No one interrupts now. In 1942, that sentence would have caused a fight. In 1943, it causes grim attention. We have changed codes, he continues. We have altered call signs and reduced traffic. Yet the enemy continues to position forces with unusual confidence. This suggests either continuing compromise of some communications or effective traffic analysis combined with reconnaissance. Nagano's eyes narrow, so even silence can speak. The intelligence captain bows his head. Yes, Admiral. A staff officer, frustrated, speaks too quickly. Then what do they have? A magic ear, a magic eye. How do we strike that? Nagano answers with something that sounds like an old man's truth. You cannot sink an air, he says. You cannot torpedo an eye. The room holds still, because everyone understands what he means. You can destroy ships, you can burn fuel dumps, you can shoot down aircraft, but how do you destroy a system that converts whispers into action? At Hashirajima, Yamamoto's staff reaches similar conclusions. In diary entries and staff notes, the tone shifts from suspicion to certainty, from anger to sober accounting. They describe the Americans as methodical, quick to learn, efficient in coordination. They speak of radar not as a novelty, but as a standard tool. They speak of American cryptanalysis as a shadow that follows every Japanese plan. Even the way Japanese admirals talk changes. They begin to speak less of decisive battle and more of avoiding disadvantage. In late spring, A combined fleet officer returns from the South Pacific and briefs senior leaders on what sailors are saying in the fleet. The word spreading from destroyer crews to cruiser bridges. Night is no longer safe, the officer says. The Americans can see. They open fire first. Their ships act together as if sharing a single mind. Sharing a single mind. That phrase lingers like smoke. Nagano folds his hands, looking down at the map. It is not just a map now. It is a ledger of opportunities lost. Midway, Guadalcanal, the long stretch of ocean where Japan once believed American reaction would be slow, blind, and predictable. He looks up, their secret weapon. He says, voice quiet. Is not one machine. No one speaks. The staff waits. It is the combination. Nagano continues. Information gathered, transmitted, and used faster than we can respond. A senior admiral beside him, a man whose confidence once filled rooms, gives a slow nod. Radar, he says. Code breaking. Carrier coordination. He says each phrase like he is naming an enemy. He cannot duel with the sword. Outside the ministry, Tokyo continues to function. Trains run. Office workers hurry. But inside, Seoul, the Navy's highest men are admitting something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The war is not only being fought by ships and pilots. It is being fought by analysts, by technicians, by disciplined procedures, by a culture that turns information into weaponry. In the final minutes of the meeting, the conversation turns to solutions, but they sound smaller than the problem. Increase radar production, improve training, tighten radio discipline, develop counter-radar tactics, encourage decentralized initiative. Each proposal is a patch on a hull that has been pierced below the waterline. The combined fleet representative stands to leave. Before he does, he offers a final line from Yamamoto's headquarters, not as propaganda, but as an observation from a man who understands his enemy. The Americans, he says, are fighting with their minds connected. Nagano stares at the table for a long moment. Then he speaks softly, almost to himself. Then we must cut the connection. But how? You, listening to this story now, can feel the dread that sat behind those uniforms. Because the secret weapon was never a single dramatic invention revealed with a flourish. It was a quiet revolution in how war was seen and understood. At Midway, Japanese admirals began to suspect the United States had an unseen advantage. By Guadalcanal, they felt it in the darkness as shells found them first. By 1943, they could name it. Radar that erased night. Cryptanalysis and traffic analysis that turned radio waves into forewarning. Carrier coordination and disciplined procedure that made American fleets act with speed and unity. The Japanese admirals did not all say the same words, but the meaning converged into one verdict. They were fighting an enemy who had learned how to see